Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break with Paolo. I'm Paolo von Schirach, your host and president of the Global Policy Institute, a Washington, D.C. think tank. This podcast is brought to you by Bay Atlantic University, located in downtown Washington, D.C., just 2 blocks from the White House. This series is produced by Switch and Board, also located in Washington, D.C. Today, we're talking U.S. foreign policy and global security challenges. To discuss all this, we have with us Doug Macgregor. Doug is a retired U.S. Army colonel who saw real combat. Nothing to sneeze at because it's not that common these days, right? He'll talk about it, I'm sure, a little bit. He's also, very importantly, the author of 5 books and holds a PhD. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's start with us, the home front. What's going on in the United States now, and how does public opinion and the general understanding that the public and the elites may or may not have about international affairs, how does that prepare the United States to be a player internationally?
I think this is probably the most important question that is so seldom raised. It's certainly not understood overseas when you begin to try to answer it. So I think we should spend a few minutes on this. The first thing to understand is if you go to the Pew Research site and you look at polling data going back many, many years, decades in fact, there's very, very little evidence that Americans are enthusiastic in any way about the use of American military power beyond the borders of the United States. In other words, if you start looking at what people thought in 1914, in 1940, in 1960, 1970, 80, 90, and even now, the majority of respondents do not like the idea of American military power being engaged overseas as a general principle. They would prefer that we not be engaged militarily, specifically in conflict. There's another issue that doesn't come up, though, that has to be borne in mind, and that is that most people on any given day are really not interested in what happens beyond the borders of the United States. Now, this is good news for the elites in Washington and New York City and places like that, because there's very little attention devoted to what happens overseas, which means decisions can be made without necessarily consulting the American people that might otherwise be rejected. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that Americans really don't want to meddle in other people's affairs. And I think your listeners, particularly those overseas, should be very happy to hear that because it's true.
Unfortunately, the image that we convey is exactly the opposite,
Absolutely.
right? That we are this overpowering, bully, starting wars at the drop of a hat, and people can list everything: Vietnam and this and that, and interventions in Central America, whatever that is, and then of course, closer to our times, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq, where you were part of that, right, in your own professional experience. And then now we're talking, we're going to go to war with Iran. Is it going to be another war here? Are we going to go to war with North Korea? Are we going to go to war with China? All these things are popping up at the drop of the hat.
Well,
what do you say?
I think what's changed in recent years is, first of all, that we are almost 75 years from the end of the Second World War. And there is very little tolerance anymore in the population at this particular point in time for conflict overseas, for embroiling us in conflict overseas. And most important, that means casualties.
Yes.
American losses overseas. And it's very difficult to explain to the American electorate why we would be interested in fighting with Iran or fighting with China or fighting with Pakistan or anybody that you can point to right now. The average American looks and says, well, all right, perhaps they're not, quote unquote, everything they should be. But why are we involved? And I think this is something that President Trump, as a candidate, clearly understood. I think he still understands it. The interesting part is he lives in the center of Washington, D.C., surrounded inside the White House and in his administration and on the Hill by thousands of people who are desperate to keep us committed overseas everywhere. And there are 2 reasons for that. Number one, they really truly see the United States as the center of the world. I think President Trump loves the United States. I love the United States, but we realize the United States is one of many great powers. We have interests in many places, but we don't necessarily have an interest everywhere in everything. It is actually possible to sit here and say, well, if country X and country Y want to fight with each other, ultimately that's their business. If we can help mediate or bring it to a close, we're happy to help, but we really don't want to be involved. It's kind of interesting that 75 years after the Second World War, this mentality is creeping in, whether the elites inside Washington like it or not, into the daily dialogue.
Explain to us, how did we get into Afghanistan and later on, and it's much worse, I guess, Iraq in 2003. Of course, we know 9/11, we know Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan, and all, but lead us into this, because most people say, what happened? It's been 18 years,
right,
and we're still there, and we are not winning, and what's the matter, and what is so vital in terms of American interests
absolutely
to continue this thing?
I'll give you a quick example, and this is something that people really ought to do who are interested in understanding the answer to your question. Go back and look at the orders as they were explicitly written, the military orders, to senior officers in 1991, in 2001, and then subsequently in 2003. And in each of those, there are very specific mission orders that say, you're going to go into Kuwait and into southern part of Iraq to eliminate the Iraqi military presence in that country, and specifically to find and destroy the Republican Guard. That was 1991. That was it.
Yeah.
That's all.
That was a limited, circumscribed
Absolutely.
objective.
We didn't do it. We didn't eliminate the Republican Guard. Most of it escaped. That's another issue. But the point is, if you read that, there's nothing in that about we're going to cross the Euphrates River, occupy Iraq, and transform it into a liberal democracy. Absolutely, totally absent. You go to 2001, we were supposed to go into Afghanistan explicitly to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, his inner circle, and perhaps 500 to 800 people that were fighters up there associated with this Al-Qaeda entity. That was all. There was nothing in there about make war on the Taliban, which was completely separate, distinct from Al-Qaeda. But unfortunately, we didn't do something that the British, who were very successful imperialists, always did. We didn't practice economy of enemies. And so we have the president making statements along the lines of, you're either with us or you're against us, when in fact, truthfully, most people on any given day are neutral. They're not necessarily involved. And the idea that you could provide, say, several bags of gold to the Taliban, who would then willingly turn these people over to you to be rid of them, simply was dismissed out of hand. And so you then go in to do one thing, and then somebody says, well, we really have an obligation to stay here.
Which obligation?
Why? Well, we have to help the Afghans become a modern state. Who are the Afghans? Which ones? The Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazara, the Pashtun? I mean, help us out here so we understand who these people are. Again, sort of like Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a region, not a nation per se. Well, then we'll turn it into a nation, and they'll all learn to live together and so forth. So you go in for one reason, which, by the way, we failed. We did not kill or capture Osama bin Laden. And we should have relieved the four-star who was in charge, because he had billion-dollar assets, the National Security Agency, the CIA, Special Operations Command, and failed miserably. We don't. He's not held accountable. In fact, it looks as though people were happy that this then became a reason to stay there, even though everyone with knowledge of the region said, whatever you do, you don't want to stay in these places. You'll become a magnet for hostility, hatred, corruption, and so forth. So then you fast forward to 2003. We're going to go in to eliminate the Saddam Hussein regime, preferably to capture or kill him and his inner circle. And that was about it. And eliminate this
and turn it
alleged
over
WMD.
to the Iraqis in London and all that
and
stuff.
The expectation was that we would, in fact, not dismantle the Iraqi army, armed forces, police, and administration. But then you realize the generals arrived there after 2 weeks. They move into palatial settings where they feel very important and like conquerors, which was exactly the wrong thing. And then suddenly they do nothing, and Baghdad descends into chaos. And a decision is made here in the Oval Office with Dr. Wolfowitz and Vice President Cheney along the lines of, Mr. President, Iraq is even weaker than we thought. We have the opportunity to create from the ground up the first liberal democracy in the Middle East that will be friendly to Israel. Only someone who is smoking crack on a routine basis would ever reach such a conclusion, but unfortunately, the answer was, yeah, great, let's do it. And so we end up, once again, descending into madness. We end up in a war with people who were never the enemy, who had nothing to do with 9/11. Al-Qaeda, that had no foothold in the country, thanks to Saddam Hussein and his secular regime, gains one. We obliterate the Sunni Muslim population, which had historically controlled it, in favor of the Shiites. In the meantime, thousands of Iranian agents go into the country who've been studying it for years, cultivate support, and voila, by 2011, Iraq is effectively aligned with Iran. Our position is untenable, and thankfully at that point we left. Of course, then the argument is, well, you see, you left and so you got ISIS. No, we created the foundation for ISIS long before we left. And that then was simply taken advantage of by other actors in the region, and the rest is history. How do you deal with this? The only thing that you can do under the circumstances is what President Trump has been trying to do for the last 2 years. Leave. End it. Get out. You can't fix it. You can't transform it. And your very presence is part of the problem, not the solution. And then figure out who is your partner in the region and who is not. Try to work with your partners and try to cultivate new ones, instead of looking at a country like Iran as this permanently hostile entity whose regime absolutely must change, even though we have a long, long history of experience with sanctions that tells us that sanctions do not change regimes. Sanctions make populations miserable, but sanctions don't put new governments in. And by the way, how do you rebel against a government when you have perfect gun control in Iran and the rest of these countries where the entire population is disarmed? So it's absurd nonsense. All you're doing is making large numbers of people miserable. So it might be useful at this point, I would say, when we talk about sanctions regimes, again, sanctions against Russia, sanctions against everyone in sight, to back away from the assumption that these things are necessarily inducing change in behavior when they don't.
But the argument, of course, that if we go back to the Bush administration and even those inside now the Trump administration who are pushing for, no, let's stay a little longer, let's do this, because the idea, if we leave, these places will become staging ground for something really bad that's going to hurt us. What do you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, we don't have much evidence that these countries are going to become the staging grounds for something bad to hurt us unless we insist on open borders and uncontrolled immigration. If we go back to 9/11, first of all, the people that committed the 9/11 atrocity came here under false pretenses. They pretended to be students under student visas. They obviously weren't. Very few people tracked them. Then they became illegal because they stayed beyond the limits of the visa. So now they're illegal, in addition to having come under false pretenses, and they're still not being effectively tracked. And they could move back and forth across the borders at will. They planned most of what they did in Hamburg, Germany, not in Afghanistan, which is not a particularly good place to plan much of anything except getting out. And then they planned the rest of it here in the United States. So the lesson of 9/11 is your first act, instead of invading another country, is close your borders. Find out who's in the country. Get control of who's here. We didn't do that. And here we are, 19 or 18 years later, we still haven't. And we're worrying about what somebody in the vast reaches of the Hindu Kush might do. That's absurd.
But the philosophy, again, I think you summarized it earlier, but I think for the benefit of our audience, I think it's important to point this out. The philosophy at the time of the Bush administration and the people who were surrounding the president, you mentioned Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Cheney and all these people, said, no, in order to be safe in the United States, we need democracy everywhere, right? We need to spread the good seeds of democracy because, and that's theoretically true, democracies are peaceful, at least in general, not always, but in general, and they can be partners and all that. And if we indeed create democracy in Afghanistan, which is really, really, I mean, having been there, I can say, boy, that's a stretch. And Iraq, because the Iraqis are modern, they're engineers and doctors and whatever, and then they got all these exiles who will come back from wherever they are, and they'll be in charge and will be friendly to the United States, and everything will be fine, and they will become actually the beacon, right? The example of a functioning democracy in the Middle East, and everybody will say, me too, I want to, oh boy, it's working there, I want it too. So all that was essentially a dream. I mean, a dangerous, is that correct? I mean,
Oh, I think that's a great
a
summary.
fantasy.
Look, I think that's a perfect summary. And the notion that you can export what we are, first of all, I think that's foolish because somebody said to me, well, don't you think we are exceptional? I've said, absolutely. The United States is so exceptional, you can't export it. So don't try. But you absolutely don't want to export anything at gunpoint. Mm-hmm. Remember what Hamilton and Washington disagreed fervently with Thomas Jefferson because Jefferson became enamored of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was something that Washington and Hamilton were horrified at. In fact, Jefferson wanted George Washington as president to arrest and hang all of the French aristocrats pouring off the boats in Philadelphia, coming ashore. People like Pierre Dupont, mm-hmm. Some of your listeners will remember him, and yes. A host of others. Hamilton went to Washington and said, my God, we don't want to do that. These are the best educated and most capable people coming to us from France. They'll be wonderful
Human
Americans.
capital free.
They'll be wonderful Americans. And George Washington said, of course, I like Tom, but he's wrong on this, and the rest is history. They did very well. But the point is that Hamilton and Washington felt that America should be the world's engine of prosperity, not its engine of destruction. Mm-hmm. And that by being its engine of prosperity, what we have would be seen as something good that others may then want to emulate. In other words, if you're not at war with anyone and you're building prosperity at home and you're enhancing prosperity overseas, people will like you, they'll do business with you, and they may try to imitate you. That's a very different approach
than active export.
Absolutely, than the active export of something abstract at gunpoint. It doesn't work.
Of course, many, the old-fashioned school of thought, yeah, but we did it in Germany, we did it in Japan.
But that's a lie.
That's a long time ago, and it was different circumstances.
It's a lie, and this is very important. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a famous story that General Clay, who commanded the occupation in the west of Germany, tells. And it's a story about Ludwig Erhard, who was the new finance minister at that time of fledgling occupied Germany. I think this is about 1947. And Erhard has a meeting and he says, my God, the first thing we have to do is get rid of all these horrible wage and price controls that Hitler had imposed during the war. We've got to let the mark float. If we don't let it float, we'll never get out of this economic mess. So they said, what do you want us to do? And Erhard said, let the mark float, let it go. And said, well, the Americans and the British will be furious. The Russians, everyone will dislike this. He said, I don't care, that we've got to do this. And sure enough, his advisors were right, and the phone rings off the hook. The Allied Commission wants to see him, and then General Clay calls and sees him, and General Clay tells the story of Ludwig Erhard comes into the office. And General Clay says, well, Mr. Erhard, what have you done? And he explained, well, I did this and this. And he said, well, why didn't you go to the Allied Commission first and ask permission? He said, because they would have said no. And Clay said, quite right, let's have lunch. And General Clay made the point that during this occupation, I controlled everything that happened in Germany between the door to my office and my desk. In other words, who rebuilt the country and put it back on the track?
The Germans.
We're the Germans. And by the way, when MacArthur got into Japan, initially he did what he was ordered to do by President Truman and the Secretary of State and said, you must arrest all of these militarists, all the evil men in Japan who are responsible for bringing on this war. Well, within 2 years, George Kennan is put on the plane and sent over to see General MacArthur. And Kennan says, General MacArthur, everyone is alarmed by the rise and the power and the strength of the Communist Party in Japan. And we think that perhaps you should fix this. And he said, well, quite right. All we have to do is release all of the people that you told me to jail. They know how to rebuild the country and put it back on a successful paying basis. Kennan says, that's what you must do. General MacArthur said, thank you, I will execute. The rest is history. The Japanese businessmen, industrialists, military leaders,
rebuilt their country.
They rebuilt Japan. We didn't rebuild these countries. These were advanced cultures and civilizations in their own right. All we did was back up, finance where it was appropriate, and they made a success of it. When we walked into a place like Afghanistan or Iraq, and remember, we had been destroying Iraq for over a decade with incessant air attacks and sanctions.
Yes. No-fly zones.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was nothing like that present. And then when you make the decision to sweep away whatever was there, for instance, when they first held this so-called Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, the consensus was, well, let's bring the king back. Because as the king always ruled like a confederacy of different groups that trusted him because he did not interfere with their respective cultural distinction and behavior in business and so forth. We swept that away and said, no, take this man, a former CIA employee, and he's going to be your man. We did something similar in Iraq. These are the kinds of things that set the stage for disaster. Nothing that a people do not build for themselves ever lasts for very long when the occupying force ultimately leaves. And this is the final thing that needs to be understood. We are preeminently a maritime and aerospace power. We are not a global land power. We're only a land power in the Western Hemisphere. If we go anywhere with vast numbers of U.S. ground troops, it's temporary. By nature, it's unavoidable. We sail in, we fly in, we stay for a while, and we leave. Under those circumstances, the first rule ought to be, do no harm. We haven't followed that. We've done the opposite. We will always leave. We do not live there.
Okay, but let's say that your scenario plays out and President Trump eventually prevails on his advisors, I guess, and other people surrounding him, and we finally exit Afghanistan. It seems to be almost a done deal. Not quite sure, but it looks that way, right? That we're on our way out. Iraq, of course, we are semi-out, but not quite clear. We still have troops in the
5,000 troops.
Yeah, in the north, and then we got this and that, and we have concerns about Iran. So let's say we exit, and most likely the Taliban takes over in Afghanistan.
At least half the country.
Yeah, I don't believe in coalition governments in those kinds of places. And you say, okay, that's it. Who cares? In other words, there is really no significant downside in a strategic sense for us. And Iraq is kind of lost anyway, because the Iranians have essentially I wouldn't say taken over, but exerted, thanks to us.
The dominant influence.
We gave them this nice little present. And so there they are. Let's look around, the globe and see where are, in your judgment, in your professional and analytical judgment, the threats. Of course, people say, North Korea, the nukes, or China, emerging global challengers, they're doing this and they're doing that, the Belt and Road, and encroaching everywhere in Asia, in Africa, and now the South China Sea. What is it?
Well, I don't think...
how do you read it?
Well, first of all, I don't see the threat-filled or threat-populated world that most of the people inside the Beltway who are justifying $750 billion a year for defense see. If we look at Korea, North Korea is a state effectively circling the drain. It's finished economically. It has no future. It lags somewhere behind Ethiopia in GDP. So I think President Trump has always understood that, which is why he called their bluff. Whatever they get that they use for any length of time is given to them right now by Mr. Putin in Moscow. He sees North Korea as a useful hedge, strategic hedge against Japan. People forget that the Korean economy in South Korea, the Republic of Korea, 49 million people, is much larger and more robust than the economy of Russia, which has 140 million people. In addition to that, Japan's economy is 2.5 times the size of South Korea. So if you're sitting just north of Korea in Siberia, where you have very few Russians and a lot of people who aren't Russians, you're probably worried. And you see North Korea as somewhat useful because it can somehow or another provide you with some insurance against encroachment by Japan. But we have nothing to fear of North Korea. Its nuclear program is very dubious. The claims made for it are dubious. There's not much there. South Korea knows that. China knows that. So if you're sitting in Beijing, you're sitting in Seoul and Tokyo, all three of those capitals can agree on one thing: no war. No one wants one. It's bad for business. They want to get on with things. President Xi has made it very clear to President Kim that he needs to do business with us and with Seoul. President Xi would like Seoul to become responsible for the disaster in North Korea, manage it to extinction. They don't want millions of starving North Koreans throwing themselves into Manchuria. And by the way, President Xi has just finished a brilliant wall of barriers for 1,100 miles between the border of Manchuria and North Korea for that very reason. Doesn't want it. He's not going to allow to happen to him what we've allowed to happen to us.
So he's down the wall.
Absolutely.
But the North Korean didn't pay for it.
No, they didn't pay for it. But in effect, they, in a kind of a strange way, because they've been under tough sanctions, perhaps they have, but that's neither here nor there. The issue is that there's an opportunity to end this mess on the Korean Peninsula, to sign an end of war agreement. That's what President Trump needs to do with President Xi and the Korean leaders. Secondly, turn the operational control of the peninsula militarily over to President Moon. Okay. And then schedule the withdrawal of our forces from South Korea to match the dismantling of the nuclear capability, whatever it is in North Korea. That's it. It's over. The war's over. South Korea won. North Korea lost. Time for us to leave. The Japanese, I'm sure some of your listeners know that when President Trump was in Japan, he said, I don't understand this. Japan is an immensely wealthy, successful country. They don't need our help to defend themselves. And what is this treaty we have under which we come to their aid, but they don't come to ours? Well, these are things that are legacies from the Cold War. None of these things make any sense. Even if we move to Europe and we look at Russia right now, Russia is in no position to field massive armies with the goal of invading Eastern Europe. Look, if Putin wanted to do such a thing, and he had the capability, I suppose he would have done it already in Ukraine. It hasn't happened. Because frankly, killing Orthodox Ukrainians is not very popular in Orthodox Russia. Mm-hmm. Ukrainians are brothers under the skin. This is not quite a civil war, but it might as well be, so why would we want to do that? So I think it's time for us to step back from this entire world structure that everyone worships as the international liberal order, and understand, first of all, it doesn't make a lot of sense anymore because the interests that underpinned it no longer exist. And instead of seeing this as something bad, we should look at the recovery of the world since World War II as an essentially positive thing. Mm-hmm. And if we want to pat ourselves on the back, then let's congratulate ourselves on the restoration of health, the restoration of healthy countries, of great powers in a multipolar system, and stop pretending that it's a unipolar moment or a bipolar fight with China or anything else. It's not.
About China, again, one thing that Mr. Trump has done, wittingly or unwittingly, correct me if I'm wrong, is that he has managed to catalyze, to get everybody's attention on the danger of China. Of course, it started with a trade deficit, but then it has become a much larger conversation about some kind of a strategic threat posed by China, whether it's by their own mercantilist policies or unorthodox ways of doing business.
Never by Trump, always by others.
Yeah, I mean,
he does not depict China as a military threat to anyone. That's being done by others around him and in the Defense Department and part of what I call the Washington war lobby. He has limited his criticism, and rightly so, to our disagreements with China over trade, and he's focused very, very intensely on this IP problem.
Yes.
Now, I'm sure your listeners understand that the whole notion of intellectual property is foreign to the Chinese. Culturally, they don't understand it. It took the Koreans and the Japanese a few decades to come to terms with it. They're now part of this larger economic structure.
Rules-based system. Yeah. You don't steal intellectual property.
Right, but the Chinese don't quite get it. But here's another aspect that nobody seems to understand. This is a nation of 1.2 billion. I'm not sure that President Xi can deliver on the level of compliance that we would like because he swims in an ocean of corruption. People aren't paying attention to the hundreds of people that have been arrested and executed in the Chinese armed forces, inside Chinese industries. China has a huge problem, and it's going through a downturn.
Yeah.
So none of us knows with precision how this will play out, and as ever, you have large numbers of people whining and complaining. But I think Trump himself, the president, is on the right track. And I know that the president, and I'm sure when he says that President Xi is interested as well, would like to come to some sort of arrangement. How soon and under what circumstances and how much is a mystery. I think it will work out. But the notion that we should be militarizing Asia at this point is absurd. Japan is an immensely powerful country, and if the Chinese became truly aggressive, which they are not militarily at all, they would have to deal with Japan, and they know that. And no one wants to.
So you don't buy the idea of this sort of existential, threat posed by this rising, boisterous, aggressive China?
Everyone in Asia looks with great fear and suspicion on China. Chinese are not popular in Asia. They're seen as a sort of parasitic element that moves into their societies, tries to take over, absorb their capital, and so forth. China has no friends on its periphery. Everyone on its periphery is appalled and afraid of China. Why should we join this? We don't need to.
Mm-hmm. Some people, of course, South China Sea, it's considered by many, look at that. This is what they're doing. That's kind of an appetizer for other things to come.
Then make the same comment about Vietnam. Vietnam is militarized as many sandbars and islands as the Japanese have. Then condemn Taiwan, which is engaged in exactly the same thing. The claims made by Taiwan and China are indistinguishable. By the way, we don't know how the next election will turn out in Taiwan, but the KMT could conceivably win, and they're talking about peaceful reunification with China. Then look at the Filipinos. The Filipinos are unhappy with some of the things the Chinese do, but every time they appeal to Beijing, Beijing backs off and makes arrangements and accommodates them. Again, the Chinese need access to the South China Sea more than anybody else. The notion that they would block it is absurd.
Yes.
They have never stopped a commercial ship. So if I were running the show right now, I would say, look, we don't need to recognize anybody's claim in the South China Sea, but we also don't need to actively oppose them. It's not our affair. And as long as traffic moves through,
as long as we have
interruption,
innocent passage, freedom of navigation, and all that stuff, we're good. Who cares about who controls this rock and the other rock, and
let them sort it out.
So basically what you're saying is that if we can find our dispute with China where it really matters, which is on economic trade, intellectual property protection, technology transfer, and all that stuff. Again, also we don't have time for this. Maybe it will be for another chat. But there's a lot of dispute as to whether China is on the up and up or whether they have peaked, and maybe now they've reached the limit of what their system allows, which is in my mind, I don't know your reading on this. Basically, it's very hard to be a command and control country and innovative. It's very difficult to mix the two. In the past, it hasn't really worked very well. Do you think that's possible in the case of China, based on your understanding?
I think potentially there are 5 different Chinas inside China that could emerge in the future. And having had some discussions with people at the top back in 2000 and 2001, their view at that time I can't go into details, but these were very, very senior people in both the military and political side. They said something along the lines that you did. How much can we reasonably manage and control from Beijing? So there has to be some devolution of power and influence. The problem for the party in Beijing, though, is that whenever this occurs, China fragments, and they fear fragmentation. So again,
has happened before.
Yes, and people also forget that 50% or more of the Chinese defense budget is spent internally on internal control. And if you look at the forces outside of Hong Kong right now who could be sent into Hong Kong, that's not the military. This is the People's Armed Police. These are vast numbers of people who are trained exclusively for the purpose of internal suppression of dissent and control. Mm-hmm. They've got a real problem. And when you face these kinds of dilemmas, you're not aggressively expanding. And the last time the Chinese tried to move any troops towards Vietnam, it didn't work out very well. I don't think they want to do it. I don't think it's going to happen. So I think we're looking in the wrong direction for the wrong things when you look at the military dimension.
So just to put it all together, give us your summary here. It seems like that we've gone into too many places for the wrong reasons. Is that a fair condensation?
Yeah, and by the way, that also applies to Latin America.
Yes.
I mean, why?
Tell us about Venezuela. We have a couple of
would-
minutes left
Why
here.
would we ever go into Venezuela at this particular stage? And again, the sanction regime is not damaging the government or weakening it. On the contrary, the government is probably stronger. If the sanctions regime is maintained, another 8 million people will probably leave Venezuela. And the people that leave are always the ones you would like to stay because they have the most talent, the most ability to interact with the rest of the world, and more important, they're the people who would present some resistance to Maduro. So the sanctions regime is not having the desired effect. Let's stop it. Let's change our approach. We may not like Maduro, but there is no certainty that Maduro will last in perpetuity.
So why have we picked this fight? I mean, this was not
We have
mandated. I mean,
yeah,
this
no,
is something the administration, with Vice President Pence, it seems to me, leading the charge,
Yes.
and say we got to get rid of this and democracy and this and that. We got to do this and blah blah blah. And by the way, Maduro is still there, right?
Of course,
pretty much there with the narco traffic money and all that ways to sustain his regime, and the Cubans, I guess.
If you want to
helping him.
intervene in an area that would probably be more important to our security, it would probably be Mexico, not Venezuela. But our experience in Mexico tells us that intervention there will not ultimately change anything in Mexico. So we don't go. The best you can do is control your borders, your coastal waters, worry about the security of your country, and then re-examine this sanctions regime because it's not paying off. And we can reduce the sanctions. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, we have history that suggests that when the sanctions are reduced, suddenly you have a more pliable partner. Well, thank you for reducing the sanctions. Can we talk?
Mm-hmm.
And we have been unwilling to talk to anyone, but more important, we've been unwilling to listen.
Yeah. Look, to put it all together, of course, your positions, which are really very interesting, and sort of against the conventional wisdom and very welcome on this program. People say, oh, but that's isolationism. We are an internationalist power. We're here to spread the gospel of democracy and human rights and free markets and blah, blah, blah. And this is why we have this commitment. And this is the foundation, according to many, and this is in both parties, of our prestige internationally. What do you say to that?
I think in the parties, for the people that are here in Washington, it's the foundation for donations to their campaigns. It's not the foundation for any interest on the part of the United States. And I think the American people are very comfortable with the Washington Hamiltonian approach. Let's be the engine of prosperity. Let's build prosperity here, and our prosperity will extend to others through trade and doing business, and get out of the business of trying to export our particular political structure or anyone else's at gunpoint. So I think we're headed there. That's what the American people want. Eventually, Washington will catch up with it.
All right. So I guess a mixture of realism and humility, I suppose.
Yes.
Right? Well, Doug, this has been extremely interesting. Thank you very much for guiding us in this complicated maze of the international political system and the threats or self-described or described threats, which turn out not to be real threats in your reading. So this has been our conversation with Doug Macgregor, and we'll bid farewell.
Hey, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.